Well, we should thank Professor Jeji Thanasi for so meticulously elaborating on the issue of Mujahedin-e Khalq and their illegal measures and illegal activities in Albania. Now, our next respected speaker is going to be Professor Robert Fantina, the university professor, human rights activist, a political commentator and journalist from Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us with our last speaker as well, Mr. Yaqub Meraji. After this speech, he's going to speak a defected member of the MEK, a former member now living in France. So now let's listen to Professor Robert Fantina.
Good day. Today's topic, human rights and global terrorism, is a timely one. We need only to see any news program to see that, around the world, human rights are being denied to many populations, and global terrorism is increasing. Many of my remarks today will focus in one way or another on the United States. As the richest and most powerful country in the world, the U.S. could be a significant force for fostering human rights globally and ending terrorism. However, since its inception, that nation has chosen instead to violate human rights at home and around the world, and has perpetrated more terrorism on the planet than any other nation could even imagine. It is estimated that, just since the end of World War II, the U.S. government has caused the deaths of at least 20 million people worldwide. Human rights and global terrorism are different but closely related topics. In 1967, United States peace and equality activist, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, demonstrated their relationship when he said that the United States was, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. This was at the height of the Vietnam War. Sadly, that fact that Reverend King spoke 54 years ago remains true today. During that time, Dr. King was fighting for the basic human rights of U.S. citizens of African descent. Despite the passage of civil rights legislation, the U.S. government was no more interested then than it is now in providing equal rights to people of color. Reverend King worked hard for this goal and was assassinated for his efforts. What has changed in the U.S. since that time? Not much, unfortunately. Young, unarmed black men, women, and children are routinely gunned down by white police officers with nearly complete impunity. The Black Lives Matter movement has worked to shine a bright light on this gross injustice, and hopefully there will be progress as a result. But even former Vice President Mike Pence, when asked to say the phrase Black Lives Matter, was unable to utter those words. The fact that the U.S. had a black president is hailed by some as indicating that the age of racism in the U.S. is over. This is a concept that only the very naive or racist themselves can attempt to hide behind. It is only natural that a nation that disdains the idea of human rights at home will be no more interested in fostering such rights abroad. The U.S. has close diplomatic ties with some of its peers in the realm of human rights abuses. Saudi Arabia, which is notorious for its discrimination against women, purchases billions of dollars of weaponry from the U.S. with hardly ever a word of criticism from the U.S. Israel, a nation that two major global human rights organizations, one based in Israel, have stated as an apartheid regime, receives $4 billion annually in foreign aid from the U.S. While the U.S. is busy dispensing this money to an apartheid nation, people in impoverished cities in the U.S. do not have potable water. U.S. law stipulates that in order for a nation to receive financial aid from the U.S., it must achieve a certain level of adherence to human rights. Israel doesn't even come close, yet the U.S. government happily sends it billions annually. One wonders just how quickly the brutal Israeli government would improve its dismal human rights record if the U.S. suddenly turned off the money tap, something U.S. President Joe Biden says he will never do. What are some of the rights people are deprived of in the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Israel? I've mentioned the murders of black citizens by the white police in the U.S., and one would think that having clean drinking water would be considered a basic human right. Apparently that is not so in the U.S. Currently, many states are passing laws that will restrict access to voting, especially for impoverished people and people of color. Hardly what one would expect from a nation that calls itself the greatest democracy in history. And one of the U.S.'s close ally, Saudi Arabia. According to Amnesty International's latest report, quote, repression of the rights to freedom of expression, association, and assembly intensified. Among those harassed, arbitrarily detained, prosecuted, and or jailed were government critics, women's rights activists, human rights defenders, relatives of activists, journalists, members of the Shia minority, and online critics of government responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Virtually all known Saudi Arabian human rights defenders inside the country were detained or imprisoned at the end of the year." Close quote. And what of Israel, the apartheid nation that U.S. government officials proclaim as the only democracy in the Middle East? Again, we will look at what Amnesty International said about Israel in its latest report, and this is only part of Amnesty's summary. Quote, "Israel continued to impose institutionalized discrimination against Palestinians living under its rule in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. It displaced hundreds of Palestinians in Israel and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as a result of home demolitions and the imposition of other coercive measures. Israeli forces continued to use excessive force during law enforcement activities in Israel and the OPT. Israeli forces killed 31 Palestinians, including 9 children in the OPT. Many were unlawfully killed while posing no imminent threat to life. Israel maintained its illegal blockade on the Gaza Strip, subjecting its residents to collective punishment and deepening the humanitarian crisis there. It also continued to restrict freedom of movement of Palestinians in the OPT through checkpoints and roadblocks. The Israeli authorities arbitrarily detained in Israel thousands of Palestinians from the OPT, holding hundreds in administrative detention without charge or trial. Torture and other treatment of detainees, including children, were committed with impunity. The authorities used a range of measures to target human rights defenders, journalists, and others who criticized Israel's continuing occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Syrian Golan Heights. Violence against women persisted, especially against Palestinian citizens of Israel. These violations of human rights negatively affect millions of people, causing untold suffering, and it's not difficult to see the relationship between human rights abuses and global terrorism. We will now turn our attention to that topic. Again, much of the focus will be on the United States. Following attacks in the United States on September 11th, 2001, the U.S. launched what it called a war on terror. A better name for it would be the War of Terror. Since that time, the U.S. has invaded and or bombed Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Pakistan, Libya, and Yemen, continues to support the Saudi bombing of Yemen, and finances the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people. It has issued brutal sanctions against Venezuela and Iran because those two countries chose to form a government that will not bow to U.S. imperial demands. The U.S. violated its own and international law by withdrawing from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and by its shocking assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. The murder itself and the fact that it was committed on Iraqi soil show U.S. contempt for international law and diplomacy. Part of the so-called war on terror includes propaganda, such as former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying that Iran is the world's chief sponsor of terrorism. As I mentioned earlier, that designation belongs to the United States. The U.S. is forever invading, bombing, or sanctioning other nations, sometimes by even saying that the other nation has requested that intervention. One example is telling. During unrest in Grenada in 1983, the U.S. intervened militarily. A few days later, the New York Times reported this, quote, the formal request that the U.S. and other friendly nations provide military help was made by the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States last Sunday at the request of the United States, which wanted to show proof that it had been requested to act under terms of that group's treaty. The wording of the formal request, however, was drafted in Washington and conveyed to the Caribbean leaders by special American emissaries. So the U.S. drafted a letter requesting that the U.S. intervene. Close quote. Iran assists its allies as called upon to do so, but helping the Syrian government resist U.S.-financed and trained terrorists is not, in the view of the U.S. government, allowed. Terrorism, when perpetrated by the U.S., is done in the guise of humanitarian assistance or fostering democracy. Neither of these lofty goals is ever the reason for U.S. military action. It is vitally important for nations that respect human rights and oppose terrorism to protect themselves from the United States and some of its more brutal allies. The U.S. record of human rights abuses, those it commits at home and those it supports abroad, and its terrorist activities are sufficient proof of its danger to the world. Thank you.
We are grateful of Dr. Robert Fantina for his precious speech on the Mujahedin-e Khalq. Now, our final speaker is going to be a defected member of the Mujahedin-e Khalq terrorist group, now residing in France, Mr. Meraji, Yaqub Meraji. We're going to hear his speech.
In 1979, the people of Iran, under Supreme Leader Imam Khomeini, overthrew the Shah and saved Iran from royal dictatorship. The day after Islamic Revolution, several political groups appeared, and MEK was one of them. After the Islamic Revolution, this group didn't participate in the referendum to determine the type of government and boycott it. They are charged with high treason. Iranian people will never forget what they did. The betrayals of this group cannot be counted, and they continue even now. This group has killed many Iranian people in an open collaboration with aggressor Ba'athist enemy. And now they have nothing to do, and they have nothing to say to history of Iran, because they are not correct. They are lying. They are fake. And I'm 100% sure that Iranian people hate them. They don't have any place in Iran. So almost of them are more than 60 years old, and political life for them is finished, and they will terminate in Albania, in Ashraf Tree, under the ground. And this is what I would to tell you. Good luck.
Well, many thanks to Yaqub Meraji for his perfect and brief, of course, speech on his experience in the Mujahedin-e Khalq. And now the last part which we are going to go through is reading the final statement of this meeting. It reads, after the victory of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the terrorist group of the Mujahedin-e Khalq, who did not vote in the elections, started to carry out terrorist acts and took their revenge by murdering Iranian civilians. They assassinated at least 12,000 Iranian people, according to the statistics. In the meantime, and in the midst of the Iran-Iraq war in August 30th, MEK members of the 1980s, in a brutal act, exploded a bomb in the office of the Prime Minister of Iran, which resulted in the martyrdom of the then President Mohammad Ali Rajai and the Prime Minister Mohammad Javad Bahonar. and a group of employees of this center, which marked today as the National Day of Counterterrorism in Iran. The purpose of the Terrorist Spring Foundation since its establishment has been to reveal the identity of the MEK terrorist group to the world. The MEK tries to hide its cruel face and presents itself as an oppressed group, and through its propaganda shows, with the help of governments that support terrorism, such as the United States, the Zionist regime of Israel, and Saudi Arabia. These governments are trying to normalize MEK's image as supporters of human rights. The MEK leaders, however, have violated international law through paying large bribes and freely engaging in their terrorist and propaganda activities in Europe. As mentioned, the terrorist group of the MEK assassinated at least 12,000 Iranian people, including many women and children, and they also assassinated 4,000 Kurds in Iraq. Obviously, the terrorist activities of this group are not exclusive to Iran, and wherever the MEK members are established, they kill innocent people. The Terrorist Spring Foundation, while offering its condolences to the families of the victims of terrorism, strongly condemns the terrorist actions of this group and requests international human rights organizations and international courts to prosecute the leaders of the Mujahedin-e Khalq. Now, one more time, I should genuinely thank you, our dear viewers and our highly respected invitees and speakers, for attending the online meeting of State Terrorism and the Black History of the Mujahedin-e Khalq. We're hoping to have more and more of these meetings related to terrorism and human rights issues in the near future, and we will definitely be more than happy and more than grateful to have all our viewers in our next meetings. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.